Like survival is our hallmark of success. And that just doesn't seem adequate. Like,
Yeah.
and when people are like, oh, I got it to breed, like,
Yes.
why do we not want animals to thrive under our care? Why do we not want to, I mean, even our very best is not going to match up to what they were designed for. But certainly a shoebox on paper towels is not going to cut it.
Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Danielle Inman, who is the owner and founder of theotherpets.com, which is a consulting agency to help both pet keepers and professionals work with exotic animals. Now, Danielle has a really incredible amount of experience. Like I said at the end of the episode, it really feels like she has several lifetimes worth of experience in one life. I don't know how she's done it. For 13 years, she led the avian and exotic team at Gulf Coast Veterinary Specialist, which is a massive veterinary institution in Houston, Texas. I think one of the largest in the world. So she has an incredible amount of experience there. She was also featured on National Geographic Animal ER, which filmed, I think, 3 seasons in that hospital. So she was a staple on that show as well. And she has just an incredible amount of field experience as well, doing different wildlife conservation projects. And she has brought all of that knowledge in to be able to bridge the gap between keepers and vet med, which, you know, we talk about this all the time. Veterinarians understand medicine, but it is sort of a big ask to ask them how to know how to care for every single species we keep in captivity. And Danielle has sort of created a role for herself bridging that gap. And it is a really incredible conversation. We discuss everything to do with her background, the type of work she does, the type of things that people consult her on, how you can use her services if you want, and also the incredible amount of invasive species in Texas and the sort of animals that she would find and see on a regular basis in the clinic. And it is an incredible episode. It's a lot of fun. We just, meander around many different topics. So it is very enjoyable, or was enjoyable for me, and I know it will be enjoyable for you. If you're looking for more information on this episode, make sure you head to animalsathomenetwork.com. If you would like to help produce the podcast, you can do that over at patreon.com/animalsathome. I do greatly appreciate everybody who is a patron at this time. It really does help me make the show happen on a weekly basis. Thank you so much to CustomReptileHabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Affiliate links in both the YouTube description and the show notes. Let's jump into the episode. Enjoy.
Welcome to the GoFundMe for the Ball Python Deep Dive Project. This is an episodic docu-series. We want to include all the relevant studies on ball pythons and then weave that into the story, weave that into the journey of discovery for the viewer. But this isn't just a documentary, we're doing real science at the same time. So we're creating an international study on how ball pythons use their enclosures. And then finally, we want to analyse all the interpretations, all the footage of wild animals. Bring it all together, extract the data from studies, look at this holistic viewpoint, and then identify the gaps. And then go out to Ghana ourselves and film those gaps. We want to go to Ghana with a team of professionals and film ball pythons in the wet season. Will there be so much flooding that ball pythons are forced to climb for refuge? Or will they just be moving in their environment? Let's find out. Either way, we'll show what we find. This is something of an order of magnitude that has never been done before. We want to set a new bar and put it right up here. So if you would like to help in any way to make this possible, then please check out the GoFundMe.
Awesome. Well, Danielle, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to chatting with you. You have experience in all different areas, and definitely some areas such as production on TV and whatnot that many people won't have had experience in. So I'm definitely interested in picking your brain on that. And you were actually recommended by one of the listeners as well. So if that listener is listening, then thank you for the recommendation, because I think we can have a great conversation. Yeah, it's awesome. Why don't we get into a little bit about your background? How did you fall into the world of uncommon, or you had a different phrase of, I call them uncommon. On your website, you labeled maybe non-traditional, or I think it was a phrase you used.
Yeah. And I use that because of, my last decade and a half have been spent in veterinary medicine. And so in veterinary medicine, we call them special species or non-traditional pets usually. But, in my my consulting firm, I call them other pets. Cause you always have those like forms you fill out where it's like dog, cat, horse, other.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, most of what we deal with is other. I think I was just like, from an embryo on, I just was fascinated by these different species. I mean, people ask me all the time, what's your favorite animal? I have no idea. Like I couldn't even, I could barely pin it down to a phylum. Like I love animals. And, from the time I was small, I was like that weird, kind of like Dennis the Menace kid. I had this like red wagon that I would pull all around. I like hitched it to my bike and I made like this little terrarium in it. And I had like rocks and I would collect all these cool bugs from like every rock that I flipped, and skinks, which of course would immediately bail and leave. But my mom, my father has, indigenous roots, and the woods are home to him, and so growing up in the North Woods and, he would show me, this is what the deer eat first. And when this is gone, this is what they eat. And, this is what, like, when you see this bird, this is what it means. And so I really learned the language of the forest. And my mother was, a bit of a hippie at the time. And she really encouraged me to worship in the Church of Nature. She didn't, when I came home with literal buckets of snakes, she didn't like freak out and make me sleep in the garage. She would be like, okay, you can only keep these for a couple days because I don't want anything terrible to happen to them because you don't know what you're doing because you're 5. But, even though the same love and affection for these species wasn't there for her, she did have like a deference and a respect for my love for them. And she, her love has grown, I think, as a result of her understanding, at least. But I just always loved them, and I never separated from that. I feel like a lot of 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds are out like catching toads and saving earthworms in the rain. And I think for a lot of us that goes away as we become like more and more domesticated, or we grow up. But for me, it just like meant I could flip bigger rocks and climb bigger trees and find bigger animals.
Yeah. You can be out there longer and you know how to pack water and everything.
By dark. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I love, what you're mentioning about the indigenous knowledge that your dad would have passed on. It's so fascinating to hear about the ancient wisdom that was sort of born out of that culture, how well they knew the land or know the land. And even though a lot of it's based in sort of mysticism or their own mythology, a lot of it's accurate. Like the birds are flying at this time of year because it means this, or, there's whatever. I don't want to, make up a thing that's way off, but, it's amazing how much information and how much wisdom they drew from the native landscape or the wild landscape that was actually accurate when we actually look back on it.
Yeah, absolutely. These stories and folk tales and this like oral history of indigenous peoples and even, like from like the like pictographs and things, I feel like science is, I think we're kind of coming to a place where it's seen as indigenous knowledge, not indigenous folklore. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, it's, it draws from generations of experience, and a people far more dependent on that knowledge than we seem to think we are now.
Yeah, that's actually that's got to be the right point there. The importance of understanding the native habitat or the wild habitat is just so crucial if you're living off the land. And I think I've made this analogy before on the podcast, but I think it's worth saying again. My profession is I'm a swim coach. So I've been involved in swimming for 25 years. So as a coach and as an athlete myself, you learn different things. You learn about how physiology works, but you don't necessarily know the actual science behind it. But you're understanding like this training cycle will give us this effect. This type of training set does this. And so you develop this knowledge. And then the sports science comes in and they kind of, they will bring you data and say, this is why that's working, but it's information that we already knew. It's like, oh yeah, now we understand why, at the cellular level, why those, that type of training works, but it's something that we discover just by being in the environment. And that's exactly what, the indigenous people would have done as well.
Right. Yeah. I think the more in tune you can be and the more you can shut up and listen and observe, the more astute an observer you become, the more wisdom you gain from your surroundings, be those natural or unnatural surroundings. But yeah, I think it's I think for too long it was kind of regarded as sort of superstition and stories and not fact and science, which it really is, just without that name.
Yeah, it's not peer reviewed, and I think that's one of the areas that we're hitting the ditch right now with our own society. Is everything needs to be peer reviewed, and a lot of people won't believe anything until it's written on a white paper.
Right.
Well, it's like, maybe we should actually just look and use your common sense and your knowledge to understand if this is right or wrong. You don't need it to have gone through the scientific method. The scientific method is amazing, and that will eventually, like I said, prove why that thing is the way it is. But we don't need it to actually believe it.
Oh, it's totally true. I mean, and I see things, I guess conversely, I will see things that are published that I'm like, how the hell is that? Like, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that the sky is blue. How did someone get a publication out of that? And it's, oh, that was common knowledge, and nobody submitted it to a peer-reviewed journal until now. So they get credit for saying the sky's blue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. So then as far as your, timeline with animals go, did you, besides keeping the, wild-caught snakes for a little bit of time as a child, did you get into keeping pets as in your teens?
I did, and sometimes not sometimes, I look back on it and I, cringe at how poorly I did when I was a kid. And yeah, I had lovebirds when I was small, and I had a couple of mice. I ended up having a Quaker parrot later on. I had a rat snake for a while. I had a little xenopus, a clawed frog for a while. And I just, knowing what I know now, and knowing what the environments that these animals come from, and the longevity that they should experience, that's a big thing I see in my career a lot. Oh, I used to have this, and it's like, what animals should live for 30, 40, 50 years? Why used to? Yeah. And I mean, obviously we're failing large scale. But yes, I did keep animals. And then, in my later teens, that went like hard and heavy. I had all kinds of stuff. Really from like my mid to later teens, I stupidly a reticulated python. I mean, like all kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. Stuff that really debatably, and I might get skewered for this, but really may not be well suited to captivity. Yeah. I genuinely loved and respected, but I didn't have the same level of understanding, I think, that I do now. And now I do have a few animals still. I have a carpet python. I have an assurance colony of some Asian colonian species. I have used to be Rhacodactylus kahua. What are they now? Like Minerva gecko or something? No, they're not that.
Is that
what are
chahua,
they?
Like a chahua gecko, or?
Yeah, I can't remember what the genus is now. It just changed.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's not Rhacodactylus anymore.
No, it's not Rhacodactylus. Yeah, no. Just chahua. Yeah.
I have a little ball python that actually needs a home. But the animals I have now, I do my very best for. The carpet python is in a massive, like 8x6x5, I think, like outdoor, huge enclosure. Even that, I still feel bad constantly that it's like not enough.
Yeah.
But it seems happy, objectively. The turtles are in a 1,000 square foot tropical greenhouse with streams and pools. And, but I just, yeah, I guess the short answer of the question is yes, I kept animals. I still keep animals.
Yeah. It's, I think most people go through that wave of you end up getting things that you probably shouldn't have had. And well, there's things in the hobby that shouldn't, like you said, shouldn't be kept on a regular basis, and they are, and it can be very attractive to keep those things without really having a full grasp of what it actually means to keep, like a mainland reticulated python, for example. So then as far as your career goes, what did you have an idea of what you wanted to do? Like, you have all these animals in your teens. I'm sure you knew you wanted to have an animal focused career, but did you know what direction you wanted to go with it?
It sort of just like happened. I wasn't sure, I always I was fascinated by, like the neotropics my entire life. And, I knew I wanted to see them firsthand. I knew I wanted to travel. I was always passionate about conservation. I remember like crying when I was 5 years old, reading about kapok trees being cut down. And, the entire environment and home for so many species that went with that. And I always, veterinary medicine always intrigued me. I always wanted to help, to heal. And so I just sort of accidentally kind of wove all of those things together. And I'm incredibly fortunate that it has worked in the way that it has. But I started early on working, in a private but very well done reptile zoo. And then I kind of like got into veterinary medicine. I started as a receptionist. Yeah, I started as a receptionist, and then I was an assistant, and then, down the road I was a nurse, and I learned medicine. I've always been like, didactic learning has always been the most organic form of learning for me. I love reading. I love reading about things, but doing things seemed to seep in a bit better. And watching people do things, and hearing and seeing and touching. And so, then I was in a zoo career for a little bit. And then found myself, years later, and I was fortunate to do some conservation along the way, most of it kind of regional. And then when I was in my late teens, I took a trip to Costa Rica, thought it was amazing. I was like, oh my gosh, there's like so much going on in this world. And then the travel bug got me, and I've developed so many great connections along the way too. People who have projects, or who can partner on projects globally. And, so conservation kind of got swept into things along the way. Then I found myself in Houston, and the most natural thing, I think, at that point would have been for me to go into herpetology here in Houston. However, my husband is a herpetologist at the Houston Zoo. So that sort of precluded me from being in the same position. And everybody was like, oh, have you tried Gulf Coast? Have you tried Gulf Coast, which is this massive specialty veterinary practice? And I was like, I don't know. And it just so happened that they needed someone in the exotics department, which almost never happens. And it was sort of at this point where it had grown a bit, that portion of the practice. And so I kind of threw my hat into the ring, and started working with the specialty team at Gulf Coast. And I was introduced to specialty medicine, which is just a totally different animal than general practice. And then that's where I wound up for almost a decade and a half. And, the practice just exploded. We were, one of the largest in the world, certainly in the region. And,
can you tell us a little bit about, for those who are not sure or not familiar with the Gulf Coast, is it vet clinic? I'm not sure the full name of it, but tell us what it is and how large it is, because it's insanely
Gulf Coast
massive.
Vet Specialist. Yeah, it's huge. We had, I'm no longer there, but they have an 80,000 square foot building. It's massive. The ability to, we had multiple MRs, CTs. There's oncology, cardiology, dentistry, avian and exotics, which was my realm, internal medicine. And then within internal medicine, you have, specialties like nephrology or whatever. So it's essentially, it's like people would picture a specialty hospital for humans, but for animals, right, for veterinary. And so, yeah, it's over 300 people. I think something like 35 or 40 specialists, twice that probably in interns and residents, and then an amazing, huge support staff. Now, things have changed a bit there, and veterinary medicine kind of as a whole is in this very strange place right now. Lots and lots and lots of corporate buyouts. And, I think veterinary medicine as a whole, and I think anybody in the industry would vouch for this, that it's just everybody in vet med is just overwhelmed. There's such a need for the skill that is provided. And there's just not enough of that skill to go around. And there's also a massive deficit within the special species or non-traditional pet sector, for sure. That very little, if anything, is touched upon in vet school, in tech school. And so really you either have to just extrapolate, do your best, and try to apply cat, dog, large animal medicine to species that are fully and totally, just from a phylogenetic perspective, entirely different. Or you have to take it upon yourself to learn everything you can about these thousands of species. So what worked really well for me is I had this history in captive husbandry, in wildlife conservation, and I was able to sort of tie it all together with this underpinning of a very strong foundation of medicine. And whereas most people in vet medicine, most veterinarians or technicians, nurses, anybody, it's a rarity to meet somebody who has a background of anything more than, maybe familiarity with the most common species, your leopard geckos, your bearded dragons, your ball pythons. But even that, there's still just a lack of understanding. And the general public, I think what happens is, if you get an animal and your animal is not doing well, not thriving, the assumption is that you should be able to take it to a veterinarian, and that veterinarian should be able to help that animal. Mm-hmm. And while that is what everybody wants, that's just not the reality. There's so much more involved from every aspect of that equation that kind of both sides end up failing. And it's just become this cycle where reptiles and amphibians especially, I think, are overrepresented. I think they're overrepresented in okay. Let me figure out how. The thing is we all know the mass numbers of herpetofauna that get sick and usually die in the pet trade. And the vast majority of those animals are never seen by a veterinarian.
Yeah. Yeah. These are like your impulse purchases. People go to big box pet stores, buy a wild caught gecko, it gets sick and dies, and that's it.
Right. And they just think like, I can get another one, rather than paying $175 for an office visit, I can just pay $24.99 and get another one.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And so they're not seen as often as they should, but then conversely, what I see all too often, especially in specialty practice where we absorb referrals from general practitioners far and wide, is attempts at intervention that really just fall short. And that's, I think, for a multitude of reasons. But one is that it's almost always husbandry that brings these animals through the door, almost always. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. There are viral pathogens, trauma. It may be, if this is an imported animal, there may be parasites. It might just be the horrific stress of, endured during collection and holding, and then export, and then import, and then being at a wholesaler, and then making it to a pet store, and then winding up on a table at a show, and then, finding your way into a 40-gallon tank in someone's bedroom. But the other thing, it's very often not addressed. Like the root issue is not addressed. The husbandry is not corrected. So like many, at least specialty veterinarians, have the wherewithal to be able to, I guess, to practice interventional medicine on these species, in that they can support them, right? They can give them fluids, they can do blood work, although even interpreting the blood work, we have so few normals at this point, that's even difficult. But, they can, whatever metabolic support is needed can usually be rendered at an acute level. But finding long-term success in these cases is really, really difficult, because what brought them through the doors in the first place is never corrected. So then we might be bolstering their system a bit to send them then back into an environment that is subpar, that's not optimal. And so the long-term success is dismal at best. And then there are a lot of, GPs that they want to help. It's not like everybody goes into veterinary medicine because they want to help animals, not because they want to be rich and famous, because that doesn't work. Or because they hate animals and want your money. Like that's never the reason, right? They all want to help, but there's so little that's taught about these species that most people just feel totally, in over their head, and just out of their depths. And even, so many would get to us after, going through the hands of a general practitioner, and, maybe they had some horrific trauma, and analgesia hadn't even been, they didn't even have pain meds and things on board, because people didn't know what to use or what to do. So there's such a deficit in the face of such a need. And I think that's industry wide on both sides, in the pet trade and in vet med.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you think about someone who is focusing on specialty animals, there is such a wide variety of species. I mean, you would think as a vet, you'd need to see the same ailment in the same species a couple of times in order to feel confident to treat that sort of thing. But it might take you 10 years to get the same species with a similar ailment a couple of times, especially if you're in a smaller clinic, you're not seeing a ton of animals. That just becomes, you have to, like you said, we were talking about, learning with the hands-on experience. That's very difficult when the sample size is so sporadic and so wide.
Right.
You don't have a replication to learn how to do things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a, nobody wants to see more sick animals, but there are more sick animals out there, that aren't being seen. And, it's hard because one of the reasons that I started what I do, this consulting business, is because we're in this weird position where there are so many animals who need to see a veterinarian, who need veterinary attention. And there are so many veterinarians who want to render that care, but don't know what they're doing. And so it's hard to I'm in this position where I'm able to sort of bridge the gap because I have, seen a decade and a half worth of special species come barreling through the door year after year after year for these various reasons. But I also have seen these animals in the wild, and I also have kept these animals in captivity. And so I'm able to sort of bridge that gap and teach veterinarians and veterinary staff how to place a catheter, how to get blood on this animal, where you give fluids, when you give fluids, how to run anesthesia safely, what the best analgesia is for this animal. And then on the opposite side of that, and where I've tried to make myself very available, is for the pet owner consultation portion of things, so that whether that comes in as a veterinary referral or a pet owner finding their way to me, that I can, say, they can be like, okay, I took my uromastics into my veterinarian. They are treating this wound, but now what? And so I am able to sort of bridge that gap, speak to the veterinarian, speak to the pet owner, and make very, very specific recommendations that will help them to recreate Niger in their living room, right. And allow this animal, the opportunity to thrive.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because there is such a gap. And I imagine when you were in the clinic working, did that feel like such a missing link as far as, patients coming in, and then I'm sure they're rushed back out the door because you have new patients coming in. Did it sort of feel like you wish you had like a half hour extra with that patient so you could talk to them about, how you can go home and care for them or fix their husbandry and whatnot? But I'm sure it's such a cycle in the hospital that you don't have time to do that.
Right. That's exactly what it is. No, you've hit the nail on the head, is that vet med, we're so overwhelmed that even just finding, we would see on average 40 cases a day, which is insane when you think about, you need to speak to that client, you need to examine the animal, you need to treat the animal, you need to come up with a treatment plan for the animal. You need to a lot of these animals need advanced treatment. They might need surgeries. They might need feeding tubes placed. They might need IV catheters in. You need to keep in touch with the client. You need to make sure that the plan is enacted in hospital and all the staff knows what's going on. You need to be able to write those orders. And then there's 15 more waiting, behind that one. And so it is this vicious cycle, that even those who know, even the few vet staff or veterinarians who might know how to fix things at home, finding the time to do that and do it thoroughly is incredibly difficult. And what happens so often, and another thing that kind of got me to where I am now, is that I would see people come in with good information very often, a decent, as far as the natural history of a species can be outlined in a 1-page care guide, but still, they knew that they needed UVB radiation for this animal. They knew that they needed a varied diet of, whatever, that it's an omnivore. And, there'd be great examples and lots of good information available. There's also lots of not good information available. Mm-hmm. And people weeding their way through that is, without the background knowledge, is really, really overwhelming and difficult for a lot of pet owners, I think. But even people that had good information, the issues were often in the execution. I would see people who actually had really great UVB lights, but they were old, or they had a UVB light on one end of the enclosure and a heat light on the other end of the enclosure. And an animal is going to choose to thermoregulate, over getting the exposure to the UVB light. And things like that all the time, just these like errors in execution that cost an animal its life, and it is a vicious cycle, because you have pet owners who care, there's a lot of people who genuinely, truly care about the animals that they're taking care of, or love the animals that they're taking care of. Obviously the veterinarians do too. They're invested, they want to help. And there's just this muddy area in between that they're just not able to bridge.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you mix in because the husbandry is one thing, there's some complicated things there, but people can manage or fail. But when you add the vet med part onto it as well, then it becomes very confusing, especially for your average person. People don't know what to do when it comes to, when do I take my animal to the vet? Is this a serious thing? And then, like you said, a lot of vets are still learning as well when it comes to these specialty animals. So as far as somebody using your services to consult, what would be the average type of vet who would contact you? Is this somebody who's working with specialty animals but just doesn't know, needs clarification on certain things?
Yeah, I have, I think a wide variety. There's a lot of specialty practices who, like, these are specialists at the top of their game, who they have gone to vet school. They have then done internships and residencies, like 8+ years of education on special species. They are as deep into it as one can get. They're board certified specialists. And they know enough to know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of cases, a lot of those specialists, will reach out for a couple of reasons. One, because it takes a huge thing off their plate, right? When I'm having these husbandry conversations and relaying it to the veterinarians so that it can go into the medical records, that's literal hours of time on the phone or writing emails that they don't have to do, that they know is being done better than they could do.
Right.
So whether it's a diamondback terrapin or like something far more common, if they feel like an owner needs a little extra a little extra help, then they will refer that person to me. And then I also have lots of GPs who just, like, I have consultations where sometimes it's just, what is this animal? And mm-hmm. Some of them, honestly, there are some that I can't, they've had decades of terrible husbandry, and Colonians especially, like, much to our chagrin, they survive like a million years of evolution that has just made these guys survivalists. And sometimes I wish they wouldn't survive, because I know that they've been suffering for decades and they'll be so deformed, and all of the morphology that would indicate what species we're dealing with is gone. So then we're sort of doing this, like, trying to deduce from secondary, okay, where did you get this? When did you get this? How long have you had it? Where do you live? Okay, you're in California. It's a tortoise. You've had it for 30 years. Your uncle gave it to you. Like, it looks like, a pile of cement that, like, fell off the back of a truck and dried in the sun, but I think it's a desert tortoise.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's literally just that. But I've also had people who, just on their own, before going to a veterinarian, who will reach out and just say, like, hey, my bearded dragon's beard is turning black. Do I need to go to a veterinarian? And so then we get, a little, okay, how old is he? Does he do this all the time? Does it stop when he's sleeping? And a lot of the time I can keep people from having to have an unnecessary veterinary visit, which overwhelmed veterinarians are also thankful for. And then we troubleshoot everything else, though. Like, I'm not ever going to just leave it at, okay, well, he's hitting lizard puberty and he's just going to go crazy for a couple of months. Like, then it's, okay, send me pictures of your lighting, Like, let's go over what kind of substrate you have. Let's go over diet. Let's, because for too long in herpetoculture, we have been content to just like survival is our hallmark of success. And that just doesn't seem adequate. Like, and when people are like, oh, I got it to breed, like,
yes,
why do we not want animals to thrive under our care? Why do we not want to, even our very best is not going to match up to what they were designed for. But certainly a shoebox on paper towels is not going to cut it.
Yeah. The breeding standard is I always say, it's a very low bar. Everything wants to breed, so the fact that it bred is not that surprising. An animal can be in pretty rough shape and still breed. Right. And sometimes stress induces breeding as well. So it's kind of one of those things. And I think it's so interesting because it really does feel like you've discovered this area that is just so needed, because even a vet, they can't be expected to understand husbandry for every species. It's just not information that they even should be trying, but they're almost forced to in some ways. Like you're sort of forcing their hand. Someone brings in, well, I don't know how to care for this. That we don't want them thinking about husbandry for every animal. We want them thinking about the medicine for those animals. And then we do need this third avenue of somebody like you don't know husbandry for every single animal, but you have such a good knowledge that you can go, give me a couple days and I'll come back with a really good answer. A vet doesn't want to have to do that.
Right. And they can't. Like it's just an impossibility with the state of veterinary medicine. More and more and more of these corporate practices are even telling veterinarians like, okay, you have a 30-minute window to see this appointment unless it's a hospitalized patient. Like, can you really like go over even like an Asian water dragon? Can you really go through just the highlights of the natural history of this species and make someone understand what they need to do once they get home, once they leave and the animal has been treated? No, even if you can't. And so, it's something that is so needed. And, consulting is something that's happening more and more and more in veterinary medicine. Like there are oncology consultants and things who, because again, for sort of that same reason, like, yes, as a DVM, you are going to know all about the basics of cancer in dogs and cats, maybe some large animals, right? But things are at some point going to be out of your depth. And so having a specialist to reach out to is really important, and something that can help streamline your practice, can help uplift your team and be there as support and scaffolding, and really produces great results on every end, because you have happier clients, healthier patients, and a less overwhelmed staff. With this, especially like with the thousands of species that we need to know about, that's a very tough or big set of shoes to fill. And it's kind of only the perfect storm that has given me all of this knowledge. But certainly, like you said, like just, there is the expectation from the public, because they don't really, putting it in perspective is difficult, like they have a leopard gecko who's lost all this weight in its tail and its eyes are sunken. Like they should be able to go to a veterinarian and hopefully save this animal. Mm-hmm. But there's just so many pieces in between that need to fall into place in order for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So then if somebody wants to use your services, we can, there will be some vets listening to this as well, but just a regular pet keeper, what would they do? If they have a question about husbandry, or maybe you could just run through that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's, on my website, there's like two it's kind of broken into two parts. There's the professionals part and the pet owners part. And if you click on the professionals end as a veterinarian, or like if you're in academia, like the professionals end has like they can either refer a pet owner, which is very easy through the website, or if they want like hands-on training, you know, there's a couple of specialty practices in Los Angeles that I go to and I lecture and I, you know, stay with them through the day and help them hands-on treat every patient that they encounter so that we can make sure that they're optimizing their care. So they can reach out to me to discuss and schedule in-house teaching, training, lecturing. There's also like a venomous safety course if they want to see venomous animals and need to learn how to handle them. And then there's the pet owner tab, and the pet owner tab is super easy. You just click on it. There's a button to request a consult. You click that button, and then there's a brief form that you fill out. You can send a picture of your animal, the habitat, just a really quick history. I'll ask to fill in all the blanks as we go. And then there's a payment, $45. I keep the pet owner consults as cheap as I possibly can, because I don't want, regardless of how many hours I put into these things, I do not ever want somebody to say, I could just go get another one. Like I think that the life of that animal should be valued. And I think we have a responsibility to do better for the animals in our care. And I want to facilitate that, because I know that if they can get to me, that we can do better in some way. You know, even if the animal ultimately perishes, like at least we tried, you know, we tried everything. And I feel like there's a lot of solace to be had in knowing that you did everything you could. And then if you're going to do it again, knowing how to do it better, so that we don't just keep repeating the cycle and buy, you know, a veiled chameleon that's on sale at Petco every 3 weeks as you kill them. You know, So, and then once I get these consults, I think my website says I'll get back to you within 48 hours. Usually I get back to you within 24. And I'll ask for more details. You know, if it's, say your sand boa isn't eating, like I'll ask about feeding schedule, what kind of prey you're offering, how you're offering it, what time of day you're offering it. When was the last time it ate? Are you handling it immediately surrounding these events? And we'll go back and forth as much as we need to. Like I am there for the long haul for all of these clients. Like there are people that I have 90  emails with back and forth because they just need that level of tailored care. And then there's some people where we solve it in 3, you know, it's like, okay, well, I can see that you have a compact fluorescent light on your bearded dragon, despite the fact that the marketing on these stupid boxes shows pictures of bearded dragons. This is inadequate. And so these are the lights you need to get. This is the size you need to get for the type of enclosure you have. I would recommend a larger enclosure ultimately, but we can actually, once you can do that, we can just move these lights to that enclosure. Everything will be hunky dory. And then, you know, they write me back a week and a half later and they're like, it's a totally different animal. And so whatever client and pet need, I will do my very best to provide it.
Now, are you putting together just for yourself some sort of like files? Like for example, my job that has nothing to do with the podcast, I get a lot of the same questions via email. So I have a document that's just on my desktop that's just saved replies. And I have this sort of like bundle of packages that I just copy and paste. Are you doing that for different animals? Like you can't be answering all these freshly. I'm sure you have something that you're starting to create as far as I don't want to say
to some degree.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So to some degree, yes, but I'm also a perfectionist and I would rather sleep well knowing that I put, you know, an extra 20 minutes into like typing this additional information for this person. But yeah, I mean, I do have a lot of like kind of basic, like my list of bearded dragon foods. You know, like I don't hand type that entire paragraph each time. That's usually like copy and paste. And then I'll take out, whatever if they're like, oh, I'm feeding nasturtium and I don't know, violets already, then I'll take that out of my recommendations.
Right.
But, and I do have a lot of like my lighting lectures that I will give to clients that are, because it's so often the same thing. There's so much, we're in this place in modern pet keeping where like there's been so much research and development of products recently in the past like 5 years probably that we can really do much, much better. We actually have the ability to give all of these species like appropriate, adequate lighting. Like there are really great supplements out there. There are really great like cage furnishings. There are much larger enclosures, that are lightweight and easy for people to set up. So the stuff exists out there, but there's so much shit on the market that is marketed very well, and it's a little cheaper than the better stuff. And so I do have a lot of my kind of cut and paste things are like, this is an Amazon brand. We don't, it's not really standing up in performance tests. It's not producing the UVB light it claims it is. Jeff Bezos is probably going to come to my door now, but there's
well, they got to stop selling people like UVC producing reptile bulbs.
Right. Yeah. There's so many of those types of things where you can't help but like be so empathetic for people who are trying. They're really like, they love their pet and they're trying, and they went to the pet store and they took the advice of the person at the pet store or the person at the table at the reptile show who wanted to sell them this wild collected fat tail gecko. And it's so easy. You just put it in a 10-gallon tank on a paper towel, get a light for it. And so they fell victim to, marketing, or they even like the people who it's really like, I feel particularly badly for are the people who like actually really try to get good UV lights, or, for species that don't need UVB radiation, but we know from science research and their existence that they would naturally have exposure to it. Right.
Yeah.
So like they are trying to do the right thing, trying to go the extra mile, and they end up with some weird Amazon brand, or, a totally inadequate coil light or something that just, it's not for lack of trying. It's just, failure in the execution.
Yeah. I mean, and it doesn't make any sense. Like I've said this before on the podcast too, a thing that's difficult for us, or because we've been in herpetoculture for so long, it's hard to look at it from a beginner. But if you walk into a chain pet store, a large minority of the things on the shelves are no good for the animal, which is very strange. It's like, how could you imagine saying that to a brand new person? Yeah, most of the stuff in this section you should not buy. It doesn't compute. It's like, well, it all has a picture of a leopard gecko on it, or it's this and it's that, and it's such a confusing landscape for somebody. So it's easy for them to fall into the trap of trying to buy the right equipment and just failing in that regard.
Absolutely, and that conundrum spans, like, that's pan specific. If you walk into the bird aisle, you walk into the small mammal aisle. Hell, if you walk into the dog and cat aisle, it's the same thing. There are things that are just unscrupulous marketing. Sometimes I'm like, how can these people like sleep at night knowing that they're like putting something out there that is going to directly or indirectly cause the death of these animals? But yeah, it's overwhelming. I actually very often, when people want to, need to get something immediately, or like don't have time for me to send them a link to order something, I'm like, when you get to the pet store, take a picture of the lighting aisle and send me it. And I will circle in red, boop, boop, here's what you need to get. Because it's, there's just so much crap out there. And it's, it is really, really difficult for people to navigate, understandably, without someone showing them the way.
Yeah, definitely. And the only reason I ask about the copy and paste thing is because I imagine you must have such a huge amount of information. You've dealt with so many questions and similar questions or new questions. I'm sure you could compile quite a large, I don't know if a book is the right word, or I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but I just imagine that one day you could do something like that, because you're kind of this interface between new hobbyists or experienced hobbyists and vets, and inexperienced and experienced vets. It must be just a crazy amount of information that you have on your computer.
It is. And in my brain too, but it's, my mother actually, looking out for my well-being, was like, can't you just like write some guides? And I'm like, no, Mom, because that's like the thing is that it's so dynamic based on the situation, because that's what kind of got most of these people to where they are to begin with. Mm-hmm. So, yes, there is a lot of it that is general information, but then I need to kind of go in and tailor that to like, okay, well, if they have a 40 breeder versus, a 6 foot tank, like, while the environment that they need to create is the same, actually arriving at the parameters of like these microhabitats and microclimates that we're trying to create, it's going to take different tools to get them there. Mm-hmm. And if they have an animal that is, even within the same species, like, okay, they have a panther chameleon, but is the panther chameleon, is it like, are they reaching out because they're just first time panther chameleon owners and they need to know what to do? Like, that's the best case scenario, right? Is like, we head this all off before you have to reach out and say, it's not eating. Like, it's, its eyes won't open. Its tongue is hanging out of its mouth. But even within a species, there are so many things that can go wrong. I do see a lot of the same types of things over and over and over, which is kind of mind-boggling to me, that at this point, there's still so many people giving out bad information. But here we sit.
Yeah, hopefully people like yourself can start steering that ship in the right direction, and we start giving out more information. And I'm sure after this, you'll have people reach out to you with questions, and it's just about, the biggest thing is having people comfortable asking questions too.
Right.
And in some ways, paying for that makes you more comfortable. People would rather pay $45 to consult with somebody who they know has an expertise, or who knows, willing to scour the internet and find information for them, than to post for free on Facebook and get lit on fire and then just release their snake into the wild because they don't know, they feel like a terrible person.
Right. Yeah. And the forums and things on Facebook are just like, it's such a mixed bag. I look through those things sometimes, and like we were talking about, it's just such a rabbit hole. And then my brain and heart want to simultaneously combust. And it's just, you do have such a, like, you have the people who just want to judge, and like the know-it-all-y people. You have the people who honestly want to help, but don't actually have the wherewithal or information to actually be able to help. And then you have the people that are, piping in with really solid, good information. But again, you're kind of in that same position that you are standing in the Petco aisle, right? Like, all this stuff, and you don't know what to choose.
Yeah.
So it's, I think I feel like, it's obviously it's something I have to make a living doing. If I could do it pro bono, I would, because I want to make the most broad and positive impact that I can. But I do, I want it to be accessible to everybody. Yeah. And I feel like everybody can afford a $45 consultation for their pet.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the price of your phone bill.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you're lucky.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, some of us have to pay a lot more for that thing. I kind of want to dig a little bit more into some of the experience that it's brought you to having, the amount of information that you have. And we talked about the clinic, but I'm also curious about the Nat Geo show, Animal ER. What was it? Maybe you could just tell people what that was, and what was it like doing a show like that?
Yeah, it was actually really cool. I really enjoyed it. Animal ER was basically just like capturing, really, it was a fairly true to life, like documentary style, unscripted reality sort of show, that was on National Geographic. And they followed a few different departments within this massive specialty practice that I was at, where I led the exotics department. And because our work is so fast paced, I think the producers and the crew wanted to be like, oh, we didn't get that. Can you do it again? And that just wasn't an option. It's like, no, we can't do it again. Like it will, like, we can't afford to lose time. We can't put this animal through that. Like that's just not an option. So nothing was, it was really, I feel like it was actually a really great glimpse into what we did, into what we do. And the width and breadth of species that we saw, especially here in Texas. There aren't laws to protect people from themselves, quite frankly, but animals from people. And you can, in much of the state, like my husband and I spent 4 years working every few months in India and telling people in India that there are more tigers in captivity in the state of Texas than there are left on the subcontinent of India is like, it's insane, right?
Yeah, it makes no sense. Yeah.
Right. Like there's no way that there are that many people who can take care of these massive predators. But here you can have just about anything. And while you may have gleaned that I'm not the biggest fan of the pet trade as it is, I also have found myself in this position to be able to render aid better than most. Mm-hmm. And my primary focus is the well-being of these animals. So while I don't necessarily agree with you having a ring-tailed lemur or a kangaroo or whatever, you do have it. And so I want to do the very best I can to facilitate you doing the best you can to take care of this animal. And then from a medical perspective, obviously the best that we can in hospital in rendering care. And so the show, I don't remember, we had 3 seasons. But then we had a hurricane hit here that kind of shut things down. But I feel like it was a really good, like it painted a good picture that wasn't all rosy, and kind of showed some of the realities of the tremendous like wins, but just excruciating losses that we experience as well.
Yeah. Well, I think as a viewer, and actually I've not seen the show, I've seen other Nat Geo shows that are similar, like other vet shows, and I think Animal ER, maybe it wasn't on in Canada, maybe we didn't get it, but when you're watching those types of shows, you always wonder, like, is this scripted? Is this something that, that they've tried to, maneuver in a way to, I mean, obviously there's always storytelling, they're always going to
right.
Make things more dramatic, but it is a dramatic environment. There's, like you said, it's fast paced, things are moving, and it's kind of nice to hear that they weren't like, okay, can you redo that shot? No, we're dealing with the life here. You guys have to use the footage that you got because we're on to the next animal already.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and there would be times, they're like, I remember one of the producers being like, we need to humanize you because no one ever sees you eat. And I'm like, that's because I don't have time. I don't have time to eat. Yeah. And so I remember having like a 150-pound sulcata that had been in like a barn fire and pushing it on a stretcher. And like someone had gotten donuts. And so I was literally breaking like every OSHA restriction ever. And I had like the donuts on the back of this gurney, like right behind this massive sulcata. And I was shoving donuts into my mouth while I was pushing this thing like into imaging. I think we were like CTing it or something like that. But yeah, I mean, that was as close as they got to winning any of those battles.
Yeah. It's like, if you're going to come here and film, you can film, but we're going to still work. And
Right.
yeah, I can't imagine. I'm sure it was disrupting at first, but I guess you just eventually get used to the cameras being there. And like, how long,
Yeah.
like when they film, is it like they're there for a week, or are they there for like quite a long time?
Usually they were there for a few months.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. They'd film for like maybe 3 months or so. And I was doing a lot of work in India at the time. So I would be like gone for a month and then come back and film, and then gone for a month and then come back and film. And it was super cool. I think the one thing that would sometimes sometimes clients would be a little uncomfortable, because they like, there's so much guilt, I think, associated with a lot of what brings people through the doors of a veterinary hospital. Like they feel like they've failed in some way, like whether their animal was like attacked by another animal, whether it's because of husbandry, because of diet, because, whatever, there's that like sense of, I'm responsible for this. And I feel like a dick kind of showing everybody like my shame, what I did. But
yeah,
I think that that's something that we get most people past. Like stuff happens. Like we all do our absolute very best for the most part for these, for the animals that we're caring for, and stuff just happens sometimes. And so sometimes that level of intimacy, I think, was a little difficult for clients to swallow, but for the most part, most people were okay with it.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that. I remember watching one of those shows where a kid had his crested gecko get attacked by his cat, and I had to euthanize the gecko, and this kid is just bawling, like he just feels so sad. I still feel sad thinking about that. Like that poor kid. It's he's so young, and it's like totally not his fault. I mean, maybe technically it was his fault, but it's a lesson, and you just feel horrible for that.
Right. And it's we're in this age where we're keeping predator and prey together, and sometimes slip-ups happen. And on that note, though, there's actually like an entire chapter in well, not an entire chapter, but several pages dedicated to gecko eviscerations, because it happens so frequently, and because more and more of us tried to like, these animals are survivors. They will survive incredible things. And so we replaced the viscera. Like we would see leopard geckos and crested geckos very, very frequently eviscerated by cats. And in like a big percentage of cases, I want to say it's like greater than 70 or 80%. Like these animals would come in, their coelom, which is like, the equivalent to the abdomen, right? Like has a full thickness laceration. There might be like GI tract hanging out. You can see the liver. We like put everything back, put them on good antibiotics, and like they do great.
Wow.
So I don't want this kid to watch that and be like, "You're gonna save my crested gecko."
Yeah. It's even worse now.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe we couldn't have, maybe there was some sort of other associated trauma, but just purely eviscerations where like the head is okay and the limbs are okay, and they're not like horribly mangled. We can actually do a lot about that.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, I guess we're dealing with, like you said, evolution at its finest. These animals are survivors. Right. What were some of the strangest animals you would see, like species that you would see brought into the clinic? Like you said, Texas has a very strange, I mean, there's wild animals in Texas that are invasive, that is bizarre as well for people that don't know. There's like zebras and like African animals that are just all over the place. So I'm sure you guys saw a little bit of everything.
I literally, last year had an oryx calf in my bathroom that someone found on the side of the road, a species that like is extinct in the wild, like extirpated from its range. Someone found on the side of the road in Texas, and it wound up with me before I transferred it to A&M. But it's crazy. My husband came home and he was like, of all the things, I don't know why I didn't expect to ever see an oryx in our bathroom, but I didn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I saw aardvarks that were like freshly imported from the African continent. I saw tenrics, all kinds of weird birds, avian species, like lots of like ramphastids, like, you know, toucans and hornbills. We'd see vassas, which are like this, you know, super weird species of Madagascan parrot. It's like the only parrot species with a penis. They're very weird. And like seasonally, I think it's I don't know if it's the males or the females that like go bald on top of their head. It's a very weird, like from an evolutionary perspective, a very weird animal. Let's see. A fair number of like sloths, tamanduas, coatimundis, macropods like kangaroos and wallabies, which PS do very poorly because of our rampant issue with feral cats and passing along toxoplasmosis that they just don't survive.
Does toxoplasmosis kill kangaroos?
It does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, most places that have them will have like moats around the property, so that when it rains, it doesn't wash toxo onto the property. Because it's really, really, they just almost never, even with the, like, if we support them to the hilt, it's rare that they ever survive it. It's quite sad.
Wow.
And what else? Like lots of raptors and occipiters, like really cool Eurasian eagle owls. And we did have we actually had someone bring in penguins in an ice cream truck. That's a true story.
Wow.
It's here. I mean, it's truly like the Wild West as far as what you can get. There was a guy, there are these like, I feel like someone's going to shoot me after I tell these stories, but there's like there are drive-through safaris here, which sound relatively innocuous, but the less great ones, like you do the traditional exit through the gift shop, but you can actually buy the animals that you saw on safari. So perfect. Like someone on a whim bought like a group of 6 wallabies and a giraffe.
Oh my!
And this person, this person had like an acre and a half in a suburb.
Wow. That is so rare. Like, I can't even imagine that that's even illegal. Like, that's illegal to do.
Yeah, right? You wouldn't think, but yes. You know, in Houston proper, we have some laws, but if you're outside of the city limits, it's almost a free for all. My housekeeper not too long ago sent me a picture of a monocled cobra, and I was like, yeah, why are you sending me this? And she was like, what is that? And I was like, it's a monocled cobra. And she was like, that's not supposed to be here, right? And I was like, where's here? I was like, are you in Houston? And she was like, just outside of Houston. And I was like, okay, like leave it alone wherever you are. And she was like, oh, it's on my brother's front porch. Just a random escaped monocled cobra. But I do have to say that they called the police, which I was a little wary of. I was like, oh no, they're gonna kill it. But a woman came, a female cop, and she was a boss. She like she's done this every day, had like a hook and a bag on a pole, hooked this thing, bagged it up and left. I don't know where. I was super, super impressed. But yes, there's certainly a whole wide world of introduced animals, and especially the hoofstock. Like there's nilgai, like blue buck and black buck and oryx and axis deer and all kinds of stuff that were, you know, people introduced to hunt. And you can still do those like really unfortunate canned hunts here, you know, where animals are like doped up or confined to an area and you just get a trophy out of it essentially. But yeah, it's crazy, you know, like if I'm driving out in west, like west of Houston, anywhere, there are areas where you'll pass like high fences, like you see in game reserves in like South Africa and like Botswana and stuff. And there's like African and Indian hoofstock just meandering. And there's even
kind of funny. Go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. There's a place too in, I don't know the full history, so I don't want to get this totally wrong, but I have been there a couple of times and helped to provide care for some of the primates that Born Free has a sanctuary that's like a few hours west of here. And the reason that they chose this place was because the US government in like the 70s or 80s wanted to do this like psychological experiment, and basically took like a massive group of wild collected macaques, like it was like 70 or 80 strong, like a large troop of wild collected, I think they were like crab eating macaques, or maybe they were rhesus. It's been a couple years since I've been there, I can't remember, but they basically took these wild macaques and then dumped them in an unfamiliar territory to see if they would survive. Just release them into the wilds of the Texas scrublands. And some of them didn't survive. Like they would observe these animals and like intervene minimally and see like, okay, are they going to go after like poisonous plants? Are they going to succumb to venomous animals? Are they going to recognize predators because the predators are not the same as the predators where they came from? Are they going to recognize threats the same? So it's this like weird, cruel psychological experiment with this massive troop of macaques. Well, like a good portion of them survived, and then the troop started to like establish itself, and they reproduced as primates do. And so now there's this like semi-wild feral population of macaques who are like the number one carrier of herpes B, which it can be latent in them, right? But if we get the bodily fluids of an infected macaque on us and we contract herpes B, it's lethal for us.
Right.
And so there's I think like I want to say that the troop is now like over 100. Just like kind of wandering around out there, and Born Free like put up this sanctuary and they like feed them. It's kind of like what they do with like when they're reintroducing like orangutans in like Sumatra and Borneo, where they have like a feeding station where semi-wild reintroduced animals can like come for timed, like at 2:00 every day, they put food out on this pedestal in the middle of the desert. But yeah, Texas. It's
funny because Florida is sort of the poster child for invasive species, but Texas is kind of like right under the radar as far, a lot of people don't realize how, I didn't know half of those things. So it's kind of crazy to hear that Texas almost could be worse for invasive species than Florida.
Yeah. I think like Florida has we're a little like more, really it's just the coastal area here that's subtropical. So like where I am is the subtropics and things can survive and thrive. But if you go north, the weather gets a bit more extreme. So some of the like tropical and neotropical or species that come from the more equatorial regions maybe wouldn't survive as well. But yeah, certainly we have, I get calls or text messages about Cuban tree frogs and sulcatas and, stuff all the time that people find.
Yeah.
Monocled cobras.
Who knew? It's amazing.
Right.
Not in a good way, but
yeah.
And maybe we'll just wrap up with some of you'd already mentioned, you've done some work in the field, or probably lots of work in the field. You mentioned India, and I know a few other places as well. Are there a few standout field work, wildlife conservation type work that you've done that are sort of the top of the list for you as far as things that you've enjoyed doing?
Oh gosh.
It's probably too hard of a question.
Yeah, no, I've been really lucky and probably been at last count, I was over 40 countries. And I've been able to do some really cool stuff. Like water monitor telemetry in Borneo. And this our India project was really, really great. It started with sort of grant funded presence absence herpetofauna biodiversity surveys in the Western Ghats in this area that was like between two protected areas. That was being very swiftly developed into agricultural land. And ultimately, after 3 years of work, and we're still working on genetics to describe some new species that we found, we have profound range extensions for like CITES critically endangered species. But we actually were able to garner official protection for this conduit, for this area between the protected areas. So it is now protected. So the megafauna that are there which serve really as an umbrella species for a lot of the herpetofauna, but there are elephants, there are tigers, there are gaur, there's lots of amazing stuff, massive Indian pythons. It's a really cool place. So that was a long project. And oh man, so much cool stuff. I've tracked retics in Sumatra and worked with Palawan turtles in the Philippines, rehabilitating confiscated animals. Lots of cool stuff all across Central and Southern Africa. Tons of stuff in the Amazon and throughout the New World. I've been working actively for the last year with the Crocodile Research Coalition in Belize. And we've done some really great croc captures. And I have placed some satellite enabled tags, which was super neat. I hadn't done that previously. That's for one of the producers from Animal ER reached out and wants to make is pitching a show with me addressing human wildlife conflict. And so crocodilians are kind of at the forefront of that in a lot of places in the world. And so we've been doing some really cool stuff with that team in Belize. But yeah, I mean,
it's an endless list.
Yeah. And it's, I never cease being like excited and grateful that I've been able to do so much cool stuff.
How do you reconcile the pet trade? Because I have a lot of criticisms with the pet trade as well, and wildlife conservation, because that is a very tough bridge to walk between. And I've done the best I can with doing that by actually donating to a conservation in the Amazon rainforest from the proceeds of the show, because it's one of those things where I feel stuck between these two worlds too. Like, I love the animals. They're animals that are in captivity. I want to do right by them, but at the same time it's hard to ignore the conservation issue. How do you reconcile those, because they're kind of counterintuitive things in some ways? They
are, and I think at a point I don't try to reconcile them, because I've sort of gotten used to being a dichotomy, and I am not the biggest proponent for the pet trade as it exists. I think it's exploitive. I think it's cruel. That doesn't mean that I want to erase it. But I feel like we could and should do so much better. And really, like, there's no excuse aside from our own hubris and the fact that we think we should have the right to do things, ignoring others' rights. I think so much of what I do for captive animals, for pets and captive collections, is about the individual. About that animal. And I think that is sort of the reconciliation for me, is like that I am helping that water dragon, that three-horned chameleon. Like, I may not be making a massive impact for its brethren at this point that, you know, are unfortunately going to perish in the throes of the pet trade, most likely. But for that person and their pet, I am helping.
Yeah.
And so I think on that individual basis, that's sort of what I hang on to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Danielle, it really does seem like you have several lifetimes of experience, even though you're quite young and you've done all these things. You might need to start a podcast of your own to get into some more of those stories, because it just seems like we could talk forever. If anyone's interested in looking at the consulting, your consulting business, or even contacting you, how would they go about doing that?
They can go to theotherpets.com. And there's buttons galore on there where an email can be sent or a consult can be requested. And actually the website is still up and working, although it is under construction currently, but you can still use all the features. So yeah, if anybody feels like they need a hand, or have questions, or, you know, even if it's something that I can't help with directly, you know, I have some people reach out to me with an animal that is truly in crisis. I'm like, I'm not the place that you need. Like, we need to talk about this after, but like right now, you tell me where you are and I will find a veterinarian who will see you. And then we can talk about this. You know, I won't leave you hanging. So anybody that needs it, I'm here.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for doing the work that you're doing. And thank you for joining me on the podcast today. This was an absolute fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully we'll chat again and I can give you more stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll do another one in the future, because there's more stories for sure. All right, that is the end of that episode. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me. As I said, I think we could continue talking forever. There's so many different stories and things that you could talk about, and I had a blast chatting with you. And I think it is so important that you've created this bridge between the two worlds, as we mentioned, between keepers and between vets, and there is such a need for that. So it's a great business model, and I know that people will be reaching out to you, hopefully not being inundated with messages and whatnot, but like we said, it's something that's needed in the community. So thank you so much for joining me on the episode and also doing the work that you do. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. Again, without you, this show would not exist. So the fact that you're here listening to the podcast makes the difference between this podcast existing and not existing. So I greatly appreciate that. If you're looking for more information on the show, head to animalsathome.network.com. If you want to take the extra step and support the show in another way, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. If you do become a patron, you're automatically added to the Discord server, and you can have conversations with like-minded keepers there. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this podcast. If you are in the need for any new reptile equipment, especially enclosures, head to the affiliate links in either the YouTube description or the show notes. If you do make a commission, or you do make a purchase, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And that's another way you can both help support your own animals at home with brand new equipment, as well as the podcast. I will catch you guys in the next episode.